So for a bit of context in terms of what I'll be talking about, we'll be exploring 4 predictions: student-centered design, potential over pedigree, critiques, curiosity, and community, and porous interdisciplinary integration. So to kick us off, what comes to mind when you think of student-centered design? Perhaps we should flick to Netflix. And so in 2018, Netflix premiered its first major interactive film, Black Mirror Bandersnatch, about a programmer who was developing his own choose your own adventure game. Viewers could choose the direction of the movie. The average watching time was 90 minutes, and there were 150 minutes of footage divided into 250 segments, yielding over 1 trillion possible paths that the viewers could take. The key point is that the users could choose the pathway they took. And so student-centered design allows us to understand what our students want to learn, how they want to learn, what would impede their learning, and invites us as facilitators, as educators, to tailor our teaching to the priorities, to students' actual priorities, as opposed to the perceived ones we think they have. And just to qualify what I mean by needs, a student may think they need or want a business degree, but perhaps what they actually want is a combination of skills that helps them tackle real-world problems in innovative ways. So how do we do this at LIS? Well, for a bit more context, LIS launched in September 2021. So we are in our first cohort of students. We have 64 students. And about a year ago, we launched a sprint. So we had 2 sprints to test the curriculum, to break it, so to speak, to see what the holes were and to see how we could ensure we were meeting actual student needs. And so as part of the sprint, I taught anthropology, and I explored how anthropology could help us tackle unfairness in society. And I taught 4 different tectonic plates relating to anthropology. You can see the 4 tectonic plates there. And I gave an overview of the different tectonic plates, what we would explore, and I gave the students a choice around what they'd like me to teach in the second segment of the course. And so, as you can imagine, it was quite stressful because there was a potential chance I'd have to develop 4 different streams for the students. But for me, that was part of being able to meet students' needs. And so I set a poll and invited students to choose which parts of the course they'd like to learn more about. And so for the second week, I designed a specific bespoke course looking at product design and infrastructure and its relationship to inequality and unfairness. The other ways in which we are exploring student-centered design is in our current term. And so for term 3, our students will be working on a problem statement of their choice. Our curriculum is made up of, I suppose, 3 segments: problem statements, methods, and coaching. And so for the first 2 terms, our students have explored different problem statements relating to inequality in term 1, sustainability in term 2, and for term 3, my colleague Mattia and I developed 3 different strands for the module based on student feedback over the past few months. So the original idea was to develop something similar to terms 1 and 2, but we realized our students wanted more opportunities to be autonomous and to work on leveraging the tools that we taught them in terms 1 and 2 to work on a problem that they care deeply about. And so we developed 3 strands. The first one was a faculty-infused set of problem statements. The second one was a set of problem statements that built on the problem statements they had exposure to in terms 1 and 2. And the third option, which we were quite anxious about, was a free reign kind of opportunity and invitation for our students to design their own problem statements with some structure and guidance and scaffolding, of course. And Mattia and I just finished going through all 64 statements, and interestingly, 69% of students opted for the option to choose their own problem statement. So what does that tell us? It tells us that students have needs, and our role as educators and facilitators is to meet those needs. It would have been really fascinating if we hadn't given the students the opportunity to see that perhaps 70% of them wouldn't have even been engaged in the problem statements we had set. And so moving forward, it's really interesting to see how, as educators and facilitators, we remain agile in ensuring that our students are tackling problems and issues that they care deeply about and are therefore motivated to tackle and solve. And so for term 3, our students will spend 7 weeks carrying out qual and quant research and then translating that data into a creative product of their choosing that can be easily accessible to someone without background knowledge. And so what does this look like in practice? The product options include a podcast episode, an op-ed piece, a series of TikTok videos on topic, a poem, a mini documentary, an app, a website, a poster, or even an interactive data visualization tool. And so the premise here is to offer students ways in which they would like to express and communicate their expertise in a given area. And so to help offer inspiration, our students will be working with a series of product experts, from freelance photographers and filmmakers to product managers at companies like Spotify and Meta, to entrepreneurs and founders of VC-backed companies, to help them envision what it could look like to design a product based on research in qual and quant. Moving on to potential over pedigree. In 2016, Oxford launched the foundation year program to offer British state school students who have high academic potential but have experienced severe personal disadvantage or disrupted education the opportunity to take part in a free, fully funded, year-long bespoke subject-specific course at Oxford. These students have come from many different backgrounds, geographically, ethnically, racially, socially, and as part of this program, they're offered the chance to almost train to become ready for a typical Oxford degree. Interestingly, 87% of those on the program, on the foundation year program, end up converting to a full-time undergraduate program. And 92% of those on the foundation year end up with a first or a 2-1, which is on par with typical university statistics. And one of those well-known alums, someone called V. Katuvu, who's a close friend, went on to complete a master's at Harvard and has since published a book called Empowered, and carved her own career as an education advocate and influencer with over 258,000 subscribers on YouTube. Cambridge, Durham, UCL, and Trinity College Dublin have also launched similar programs. Interestingly, the Oxford Foundation program was built on the Trinity College Dublin program. So what does this tell us? And how are we applying this at LIS? Well, it tells us that it's important to recognize students' potential. And at LIS, we have no grade cutoff. So we have students who have achieved straight A stars, and we have students who don't even have A levels. It also teaches us that it's important to recognize students' potential and test for that and evaluate it. So at LIS, we interview every applicant, every eligible applicant, and they have a mindsets interview and a case study interview. For example, all faculty and all team will interview them on a specific topic, such as sustainability or wastage or social media usage, and they'll also test for specific competencies. And as part of that process, we offer conditional offers to students who are still doing their A levels and give them the opportunity to stretch themselves and reach their potential. Thirdly, I think one of the predictions in terms of education in 100 years will focus on critiques, curiosity, and community. And so what does that mean? There's often talk around creating safe spaces for people to discuss and for vulnerable and have open dialogue. Interestingly, I advocate and I envision that in 100 years, education will be predicated on creating brave spaces for dialogue, where students can have strong beliefs and can feel confident sharing those beliefs, but recognize that those beliefs may be held loosely. And in these spaces, students will be invited to question, surface, and challenge their assumptions and engage in unlearning. Students are not just, and will not just be there to listen, but to actively engage. And at LIS, we have a process of inviting our students to carry out homework before the class. And so this idea of homework after the class isn't necessarily something that we engage in. And so students carry out between 3 to 4 hours of what we call prep work. And we have a specific faculty member who is our prep lead. And students are invited to carry out research, independent research, ranging from podcasts to videos to articles to academic journal articles and come to class prepared to have an enriching discussion and to vocalize and apply the different ways in which their reading has infused their perspective on a given topic. And lastly, one of the last predictions that I envision for education in 100 years will focus on porous interdisciplinary integration. In David Weinberger's book, Too Big to Know, he references the evolution of knowledge from neatly defined taxonomies, such as libraries, to networked webs and interweaving knowledge-based systems, some of which you may be familiar with, such as Quora, Obsidian, and Rome, all of which are note-taking tools that encourage people to think in a very lateral way and explore the connections between different subjects. And so, what do I mean by porous interdisciplinary integration? That explores how we can apply what companies are doing to what universities are doing. So how can we create almost a permeable membrane where the issues that companies are working on are directly the kinds of issues that students can work on and are directly the kinds of issues that relate to our real world interactions. And at LIS, we kind of navigate this through coaching. And so every Friday between 9 and 1 p.m., each faculty member has a group of coachees. So we're split into, so the students are split into about 15 or so different groups, and the students are encouraged to talk through their week. And so we explore reflections, actions, and aspirations. So what did you do during the week academically? What methods, disciplinary perspectives did you learn, and how has that infused your perspective on a given topic? What are you doing now to interact and engage with that content? And how can you explore how what you've engaged with will apply to either the policy client you're working with or to another issue? And we use tools such as Miro to help brainstorm and synthesize the different material. We also have termly projects. And so as I alluded to, with term 3, students will be invited to work on their own project for 7 weeks, but throughout terms 1 and 2, students work directly with a client. For example, a fintech company looking at tackling the wealth inequality gap, all the way through to sustainability companies and organizations such as schools in America, wanting to explore how they can reduce their wastage. And so we've explored student-centered design, potential over pedigree, critiques, curiosity, community, and porous interdisciplinary integration. But some of you may be wondering, how does that scale? Yes, of course, it's okay to have such an innovative, creative curriculum when you've only got 64 students, but how will this scale all the way through to thousands of students? And I'll leave you with these questions that the faculty and I are considering. What new technologies and infrastructures will evolve to support this new emerging educational system? Who and what will fund this new educational system? What kinds of problems, methods, and communication expressions will evolve in the next 100 years? And how will we build an infrastructure to support these? And lastly, I suppose many of you may be wondering, there's perhaps quite a chasm between your own educational experiences and institutions and I suppose what we're designing at LIS. And so what will be the future of education? Will a model like LIS be ubiquitous across the UK, across Europe, across the world, or will there be siloed education establishments? I reckon models like LIS that value interdisciplinary education and very porous ways of engaging with academia will triumph and will serve to meet kind of student needs, but there will also still be institutions that meet more kind of vocational and bespoke student needs. And so that's not to say that the universities that we know of now will disintegrate and will turn into rubble. No, more so there'll be an invitation to evolve, and those that don't want to evolve, I suppose, will still meet student needs, but perhaps will be in the minority. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Isaiah. That was really interesting. I love how you left us with questions to keep pondering over. And something which I was really interested with the way you started off. You said that you built structure or the sprints so that you broke the system. And it's just very interesting that you went in with the mentality that not that, we built a structure that we believe is robust and will, tackle all the issues that will come up, but actually, where are the problems that exist? I'm really excited to welcome on to our next speaker, Emily Sharpe. Emily is a climate activist and mathematician, a fellow of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, an associate fellow of the Centre for Science and Policy, and a fellow of the British Antarctic Survey. She's a polar expert, and she previously led a UK national research program on the Southern Ocean to understand the role of climate. In 2016, she was awarded an OBE for services to science and public communication of science, and she's co-authored with His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales and Tony Juniper the Ladybird Book of Climate Change. Thank you so much, Emily. Love to have you.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to speak to you today. So I am the director of something called Cambridge Zero, which is the University of Cambridge's climate initiative that spans everything that the university does in terms of climate, all the research, which actually spans pretty much every department of the university, all the education and all the external engagement that we do. And on the education side, it's not just about the education of our students, although that's very important, but it's also about how we can contribute to education before university at schools, which is what I'm going to talk primarily about today, as well as after university, where we're very much interested in how we can support the continuing lifelong educational journey. So let me tell you about, which way do I go? Here we go. I mean, as was said in the introduction here, part of the overall philosophy of what we're trying to achieve by the educational component of what we're doing under Cambridge Zero really is to provide an education that's fit for the challenges of the coming decades. And in terms of the sustainability related challenges, there are in particular three aspects that we are focused on. One is the broad context of social inequalities, both within countries and between countries. The second is the challenges that the natural world is facing, and in particular, the threats to biodiversity. And the third is the threats posed by climate change and how those, each of these three big areas of threats intersect each other, and also intersect a host of other pressures that the planet and society is under, not least the ways in which each of these different aspects interrelate with the risks and the drivers of pandemics and of other threats to human health, the way that they act as drivers of conflict and then can exacerbate both the risks of migration and the risks of regional and interstate conflicts. So there are many ways in which all these global risks interconnect. They're going to be very much the aspects that shape the coming decades. And so how can our educational system respond to that? Now, just next door, if you, some of you from Cambridge will be familiar with this, others from outside Cambridge may not be familiar with this. Just next door, we have a very lovely primary school, educating children from the ages of 4 up to 11. And that primary school is affiliated with the education department at the university. It's the, I think, only example of a training school specifically for primary education in the UK. And we've been working closely with the head teacher at that primary school, Dr. James Biddulph, thinking about how we can help to support and create a vision for particularly primary education, not just in the UK, but globally. From my perspective, particularly in that context of the challenges posed by climate change and related issues, but also looking much more broadly across the remit of what an education that's fit for the 21st century might look like. In the context of climate change and sustainability, some of the issues that we're wanting that education to try and help shape and provide include creating a more inclusive and just society, looking at how we can help inspire the restoration of nature, addressing the challenges that climate change will pose over the coming decades, looking at the fairer distribution of resources over the coming decades. There'll be increasing pressure on our increasingly limited resources and how those are shared out globally. At the same time as looking at how we can create societies that have greater resilience to the sorts of threats that I've already been outlining. And overall, how we can collectively look to be living in greater harmony with the world that sustains us, and in greater harmony with each other. And throughout all of that, what is the role of education in helping to shape that society? So there are a couple of key aspects that we have been particularly involved in more generally, beyond just the university and beyond the work that we've been doing with the school. Within the university itself, one of the initiatives that we've been doing with our own students is a program called Engage for Change. This is very much about empowering our students, setting them up as being leaders of the future for themselves, enacting change, and for themselves being agents of change. And that idea of agency, and how do we provide within the educational system a sense of agency among particularly our young people, is a key theme throughout the work that we're doing within the university and the work that we're doing with the primary school. And we've also been looking at that very much internationally as well. There was a big climate conference in November last year in Glasgow, COP26, that many of you will have heard about. And one of the initiatives that we were involved in associated with COP26 was going out to a wide range of different countries, really engaging both with the academics in those countries, but also with a really wide range of stakeholder groups to understand what a vision for a climate resilient net zero future might be, and then, you know, having created that vision, the next step is then how do we realize that? And a key part of realizing that is building the capacity through the educational systems. So let me just tell you in a little bit more detail about the things that we are specifically doing together with the primary school and in particular the head teacher, Dr. James Biddulph. James and I are co-editing a book series that's being published by Cambridge University Press. The first edition in that series should be coming out in the next 18 months or so. And the book series is called Educational Visions. And exactly in line with the theme of today's event, it's about how do we create an educational system that's fit for the rest of this century and beyond. Very much with the understanding that children that are entering the primary school next door, who are there today, are likely to be living through to the end of the century and even into the 22nd century. So we really do need to be looking at the challenges that they will be facing over the coming decades if we're ready to have an education system that's fit for that. So it's about how can we create an educational system that allows them to thrive throughout the 21st century. Some of the key elements of the first book of that series, which is about thriving in a world and a planet that is subject to the challenges that I've been laying out in terms particularly of sustainability. But these are really concepts that will likely percolate through the other topics that we'll be considering in the series as well. How can we create an educational system that really prioritizes mindsets of creative possibilities? Just one example of the way in which we've been trying to enact that already through collaborations with the primary school is this project that you can see a photograph of here. This was an art project which was part of a program to create that sense of agency amongst the children, but also to get them to think about different futures. And what you can see is that there's a set of cubes, just cardboard boxes of different sizes. And the children were asked to create artworks that describe different possible futures. And then within that art installation, they could turn the boxes to create different futures themselves. So it's just a simple example of the sorts of ways in which we can, through creativity, start to encourage the students to think in different ways. Second key topic is about looking at local action, but with a global outlook. How can we inspire children to enact in a local way in which they can really relate to, but see that very much in that global context? And part of that is also about how can we create a global network of educators? How can we be ensuring that the things that we're doing here in Cambridge are not isolated to Cambridge, but they are very much part of a global network? And again, I think that very much feeds into the topic of today. Key part also is how can we enable students to understand their place in the world and their place in society. There's a particular emphasis here on really even the very young primary age, giving students a sense of what democracy means and how they can be a part of that. Next topic area that we really feel is important to integrate within this is both physical and mental health, and how that in itself is highly interconnected with the sustainability issues. And so that's something that we're really keen to weave into the overall arching philosophy of the book that we're putting together. And in part that is because, particularly on these issues to do with climate change and some of these other big challenges that face the world, what we're seeing is that there's a huge amount of worry and concern among young people, actually exacerbated by that feeling of lack of agency. And so how can we integrate within the educational system something that acknowledges the physical and mental health dimensions, but also tries to provide the tools to enable students to be able to respond to that. And then the last two areas that we've focused on, ethics and moral purpose, a sense that, and I already see this amongst the students, the undergraduates and graduates at the University in Cambridge, there's a real sense that some of I guess the motivations for future careers have really changed in the last few years, as people have started to feel that there's a potentially different moral purpose for their lives. And so how can we reflect that shift in our educational system as well? And then finally, the power of communities. And in a sense, the groups that are being brought together here, the diverse groups of people from different disciplines and areas, is an example of the power of communities. But how can we also reflect that more deeply within the educational system? So that's what we're trying to draw together. I think it probably aligns quite closely with many of the things that you're thinking about and discussing today. So, as we're very much on the start of the journey of trying to look through this. So I'd be really delighted to collaborate with anybody as we develop it further. Particularly in the climate change area, it really does feel as though across the whole of the educational portfolio, currently the educational system is not properly set up either in this country or globally for the challenge of climate change. It's been set up for the challenges of the past. And so there really is both an urgent need, but also an opportunity to create an educational system that really is fit for the rest of this century and beyond. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that ambitious educational vision and those practical examples of grounded work that you're doing through the publishing of the primary school. Thank you. And if there's one question that I'm going to take mull over for the rest of today, it's how can we inspire mindsets of creativity? A really interesting question. Before we introduce our next speaker, I'm going to invite you to a 10-minute coffee break. But before we do, please can we warmly thank Isaiah and Emily for their inspiring talk so far. Yeah, 10 minutes for coffee break, and the coffee is through.
Welcome back, everyone. So just as you're getting settled back in, I'm delighted to introduce our third speaker this morning. His name is Avi Warshawski, and he's the founder of Mindset, which is an innovation center which brings together entrepreneurs, educators, and researchers to develop groundbreaking educational technology. They're based in Israel, but their reach is global. He's also the founder of the Global EdTech Startup Awards, and he's serving as the director of CET's Humanities and Social Studies Department. Welcome, Avi.
Thank you, Julia, and you pronounced my last name perfectly. Usually it goes wrong, it's too long name. And I would like to really, first of all, introduce in one word, Mindset. And as Julia said, we are trying to create next generation solution. We're spelling Mindset with a C because we are a spin-off of CET, which you see here is the CEO of CET. CET is the most a dominant player in the Israeli ecosystem around educational technology. And we have the privilege to think ahead a few years and design new solution. When I'm saying we don't design anything ourselves. It's all based on the startups and the ecosystem that we are generating across them with teachers, students, and with some thinking that we try to do in order to understand what's going on. So lots of our work is in a way dealing with the future. In the same sense that Rupert was positioning it in the beginning, we don't write white papers about the future. We try to design solutions, and through those designing processes, we learn and understand those ideas better. And when we speak about 1 year ahead of schools, I think we should take a look 100 years backwards. And this quote of Stefan Zweig was about his own school experience in Vienna a little bit more than 100 years ago. And although there's very little commonalities between the schools that we see today and the school that he was going to in Vienna, I think still a student today in the 20th century probably will resonate with a lot of the description that Stefan Zweig gave about his own school experience. And I think this description is still valid, not because we don't have good enough teachers or good enough programs or good attentions. It's something about this institution of school and schooling that is not easy to change. Although all the stakeholders, I think most of the stakeholders want it to be changed, and very, very clever people try to change it during the years, it's still extremely strong and rigid. And mindset, as I said, theory of change is really bringing together startups and educators in order to generate new ways to look on learning in general and education and schools in more specifically. And we believe that this encounter is very fruitful. And as we are dealing with the future, I think we should be, first of all, aware to two fallacies that we usually have when we think about the future. The first one, I think, presented very nicely by the famous third law of Arthur C. Clarke, that compares any sufficiently advanced technology as a magic. And I think this sentiment of expecting the next thing to be a magic, to be something which is totally different from what we're experiencing, is a very deep sentiment. All those X projects, we have SpaceX, we have Google X. By the way, there is also a Mindset X. All those X usages are about saying we're doing something extraordinary. It's not what you know, it's not the reality. And I think this is one fallacy because we are totally focused about thinking about something which is not what's happening right now. And me, as someone who deals with startups, I'm all the time speaking in many places, expected to take like a new rabbit from my hat, make us excited. And so I have a VR goggles in my pocket, and I can use them if I need to satisfy some of the audience. But I think this is a fallacy, because in a way it directs our thinking about the future for the more why effect, and less about thinking in what senses it should be different from what we're experiencing right now. And the other fallacy is the totally opposite one. And this postcard that we see was designed in the end of the 19th century. And the illustrator was trying to describe the world in the year of 2000. And as we can see, he was thinking about educational technology. The kids are listening to some kind of a podcast based on the books that the poor kid in the side is chopping. But he could not avoid the existing structure. Like, we have kids sitting in rows, we have teacher, we have books, and I think this fallacy of trying to envision the future based on amplifying the existing structure is a very strong one as well. And I think the offering of startups is totally different. It's not about trying to improve or amplify the existing system, and it's not also about trying to think about fancy, shiny new ideas. It's an intersection between blind spots and opportunities. And I'll explain this idea through the example of Uber, which I think Uber is of course did not invent the Uber idea. It was other startups before, but the idea of Uber is, first of all, based on the ability to have doubt on an existing institution. Like, cabs were here for decades, and the entrepreneurs that were looking on the world of cabs had this ability to have a doubt on the existing reality of cabs and suggesting some kind of alternative. But it's not just about seeing something which is a blind spot for most of us because we're taking it as obvious. It's also about the opportunity, because this idea of changing the world of cabs could not happen if we didn't have location-based technologies and smartphones and et cetera, all these ecosystem technological opportunities that were generated in the same time. So startups have, first of all, the ability to identify those blind spots, those things that we take for granted. And second, to combine them with new opportunities. And now, what are the blind spots that we have when we are thinking about schools? I think there are lots of blind spots about thinking about schools, but one of them is the fact that we are very used to connect learning and schooling. And those are two different kind of elements. Learning is about making the most effective learning. Schooling is all the rest, is about the social, emotional, about the discipline, about reporting to the government, etc. Both of them are extremely important, but making them to be merging to one thing is damaging both sides. And we really get used to the idea that we have, let's say, 20 or 30 or 40 kids in a classroom. This idea came from the schooling part of the story, because we want it to be more efficient. But it generates a lot of damage to the learning side, because each one of us is different. And of course, there are many other examples as well. And trying to look on the opportunities side, looking at this blind spot, I think the biggest opportunity that we have in the last 2 years is the crisis that we are facing of the pandemic. And this opportunity can be told in different ways. I find the language of habits is a very effective language to describe what's happening and what is the opportunity here. And the notion of habit is a very strong mechanism of our brain. Like, we, as individuals, we have habits that enable us to free our brain to deal with the important stuff. So when we are tying our shoes in the morning, this is an habit. We don't really think about this activity. It's almost automatic activity. So we can free our brain for other stuff. But this advantage is also a barrier, because sometimes our habits are much more strong than our intention. And we have some habits that, even if we don't want to keep them, it's very difficult to get rid of them. And what works for us as individuals works exactly the same for organizations. And in the last decade, we have lots of literature, most of it popular literature about how to change habits, how to adopt the new habits, and both for the individual side and to the organizational sides. And when we look on what happened in the last 2 years, we can tell the whole story as a big shake of the world of habits, of organizational habits. And we had the habit that learning happens when we are all in the same time, in the same place. And we were forced to experience totally different kind of activity. We had the habit that learning happens when an adult is teaching a kid. And again, someone forced us to, or some powers forced us to explore a different way of learning. And this is a huge opportunity because we're, in the end of the day, we are dealing with a very behavioristical kind of phenomena. And just through the fact that we really experience the change, we have now a very unique window to see how things can be different. And that leads me to really try to sketch like 5 points that I think can be changed thanks to this opportunity. And I think the first one that was mentioned in a way in Isaiah's talk and in both in Emily's talk is the agency piece. And the agency piece is maybe one of the most challenging one, looking at schooling. And I find this term of learned helplessness as extremely effective to describe the problem. This phrase was coined in the 60s by psychologists that were speaking and also did some interesting research about the effect of being in a system that you have no understanding or control about it, the way it works. They tested it with dogs and other animals, probably things that cannot be done today. And the same kind of phenomena probably works with human beings. And schools have sometimes this danger of making us helpless or teaching us to be helpless. And today we know that this helplessness is also have some brain aspects that are very clear as well. So I think the agency piece is probably the first one that can be changed. We experience self-learning, we experience situation in which the kids taking the lead, and we have now sort of example of how can we take it further. The other one is the mixture between the online and the offline world. Again, I think this is a trend that we see in general in the last years, but we saw it even more in the last 2 years, and all those new trends of metaverse and AR, etc., are examples of the same kind of idea that we used to have very clear borders between the online and the offline, and now they are mixing. And this mixture has a unique and important aspect for education. And here I'm going back to the introduction of Rupert, basically the technology, what we call, which is maybe more accurate to say the cultural technology that we're facing in the last 2 decades, is redefining learning and education, and all the notions about memorizing, reading, writing, expressing, communicating were modified, and each one of us as a learner outside school is already in a new paradigm of learning. But when we are entering the institution, we're still in the old one, and this blur between the online and the offline that we are facing now is a window that enables us to really rethink also about what's happening inside the institutions. The third one, I think, don't need a lot of explanation. The opportunities that we have by rethinking about organizing time and space are huge. And again, this is maybe the most strong habit that was shaped in those 2 years, and really can be a key for change and transformation. And the fourth point, maybe the most painful one, again, in the last 2 years, is about the social emotional aspects. And I think always a good teacher was a teacher that could identify not just the content and that he has to deliver, but also who is the individual, the subject that really learns. And we know, each one of us who teaches, that if you want an effective learning process, you must understand who is the learner in front of you. But those 2 years of the pandemic, I think, made it to be much more louder. And we really understand now that the social emotional aspects are not a separate aspect. They're really part of the learning process, no matter if you're learning history or math, it's still part of the story. And probably many of the solutions and the new ways of doing schooling will be based on those aspects. And the last one, again, resonating a lot of the things that Emily was touching, is the global aspect. And we are citizens of a global territory. I think we were in this case for many years, but the last years, even if you don't see yourself as a global citizen, are really forcing us to see ourselves as a global citizens. We are affected by things that are happening very remotely from us. We are affecting people that we never saw. And this implies a new way of thinking of belonging, and which is the community that I'm teaching the kids to be part of. And this is really, again, a paradigm shift. It's not anymore about learning to be a citizen in my own country, not just in my own country or in my own community. It's some very weird combination, weird for us because we are from a different world yet, between the local and the global. And going back to the startups' role in this kind of a process, I think the key feature the startup has is exactly this famous Samuel Beckett quote. By the way, I was really surprised that it's the Samuel Beckett quote. It looks like some marketing guy did somewhere. But this fail again and fail better, which is the totally opposite message of being professional, of the NASA kind of says that failure is not an option. This is the key, because in the end of the day, we are exploring a new territory, a new paradigm of what it means to be educating and learning. And startups are the perfect match to be part of this process. And just to conclude, alongside with other organizations, as some of the outcomes of these 2 years, we initiated an organization we call Unboxing School. We want it to be a movement, and we are looking for partners across the globe really to send this message and have this voice, because I think the biggest dangers that we're facing regard those opportunities is the inertia danger. Like everyone wants to go back to the comfortable places that we've been before. So anyone who's interested to be part of this dialogue, please talk with me. And thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Avi. I was scribbling away while I listened to him talk, and I just wanted to read out words that just like struck me. Indistinguishable from magic, identifying blind spots, and learned helplessness. That was just like an oxymoron. It's just beautiful phrasing. And I really appreciate that you took us back to learn from our mistakes, to break the habits, to look back the 100 years, to then look ahead. Now we have the opportunity to get you involved in this conversation. So we have the amazing Carla Ayers, who's going to be hosting our panel, and we will be able to facilitate your questions through Slido. So if you open your phone, scan your QR code, or just go to Slido and enter the code, you'll have the opportunity to submit questions and really engage with our incredible lineup of speakers. So thank you, and Carla, over to you.
Thank you, Zubair. Hello, everyone. I'm Carla. I'm kind of trying to help reinvent education through the means of magic and imagination, creativity, mindset. I'm a practitioner, I'm not a researcher, and I work with a lot of startups as well as incumbents. So I would like to start the question with actually something that is applied to all three of you, but in a kind of different ways in the ways that you've expressed this. And that's about the kind of intersection points, the blind spots, and also kind of where the learner sits in the middle of that and how you deal with that So Isaiah, can I start with you? Because I think, you know, the narrative of these three talks have kind of taken us on a path that we can kind of build on. Yeah, you need to press the button.
Can you hear me? Great, thanks. So intersectionality and like interdisciplinarity, is that where you want me to go? Yeah. So perhaps to answer the question, I'll flick back to a course I taught or facilitated last Thursday. I taught or explored design thinking in the context of sustainability, and I framed it from two perspectives. So the first week we looked at commercial design thinking, and the point of that was to explore key elements of the design thinking process and how they are applied to business challenges. So to Abby's point, like blind spots, and how looking at blind spots has helped us deeply empathize with users, define the problem we want to tackle, and then kind of ideate, prototype, and test. And then for the second week, I explored how design thinking can help us look at tackling issues such as racism. And so, as some of you may know, there was an issue last week that came out about child Q, who was stopped and searched by a police officer and assaulted. And I thought about my position at the London Interdisciplinary School, the frustration that I had, and how we as a community of students could explore tackling this with the tools that we had. And so I framed the question around how can we use design thinking and systems thinking to help us tackle racism. And so to speak to the kind of intersection of combining real world issues with research methods and then applying it to things that, you know, we encounter on a daily basis, I framed this problem, and then I invited students to sit in groups and explore how they would use the design thinking process to tackle racism. And that whole experience was probably one of the probably the most difficult conversation I think I'll ever have to facilitate, because I was deeply connected to the issue, but I also was keen to invite multiple perspectives and invite students to have a space where they could belong, and frame their perception of racism and how we could tackle it. And so it was fascinating to see the different ideas that we all have about a topic that's used so, you know, the word racism is used so kind of ubiquitously, but each student had a different framing and understanding and relationship to the term. So it got me thinking a lot about how we as an institution have, or we as a startup, institution sounds very rigid. We as a startup have the opportunity to create a space where people can think critically about the topic and then relate it to the real world in a kind of very porous but also agile way. So I think that's kind of how I'd respond to the question.
We've got a question here from the audience asking about, are we really people reinventing education? And obviously most breakthroughs come from outside the field of expertise. So how do we kind of, Emily, can I start with you?
Yeah, so actually, you know what, maybe I'll actually pick up within the answer to that on some of the things that we're just talking about. Can you hear me with that, or do I need to do it? No? Okay, here we go. No? No? Is it on? Excellent. Yeah, so maybe I'll pick up on some of the some of the previous topics. So from the on the research part of the university, then both the issue of the sort of interdisciplinarity and also the fact that new ideas typically come on the intersection between different disciplines, and also often taking an outsider's perspective on a topic, all those things are very relevant on the research side of the university as well. And what we've been doing on the research side of the university to respond to the climate agenda is really trying to break down the disciplinary silos that exist, that are really deep. I mean, to come to your points, are really deeply rooted in the research part of the university, just as they are in the educational system as well. and the challenge is to try and break down those silos in a way that doesn't create new silos, because that's very easy to do that as well. And one of the things that's actually very helpful in a way with the climate challenge is that it is impossible to create an effective response to climate change unless you look at a really systemic way at the challenges. So what we started to do on the research side of the university is to really embrace that, and to whatever challenge we're looking at, whether it's about how to decarbonize the built environment, or whether it's about how to transition food and land use, we are trying to look at that from a systemic perspective and bring together groups of not just scientists and technology and engineering, but also the social sciences into that, so that we're looking at the issues really holistically. And then a critical part of that systems thinking is then identifying where are the optimal points for interventions, where are the barriers, where are the blind spots, where is that intersection between the blind spots and the opportunities, so that we can really make significant advances. And then not just looking at things from a purely research perspective, but also with a really clear view as to how do we take that research and then transition it out rapidly into the real world. I think that all of that philosophy and thinking would be equally applicable to education as it is to research.
Can I just extrapolate a little bit on that? Because of course we are sitting here in the Northern Hemisphere, we're talking about being global citizens, about addressing global problems for the future of education, but also the future of our kids' lives. And it's very easy to kind of sort of put our own perspective on this without kind of going, what's happening being a global citizen and how we look, for instance, at climate change in education in the Southern Hemisphere. So how do you think, as part of this reimagination and looking at education for the future, we need to kind of, being global, citizens, how do we kind of take that into account? And you dealing with such a fundamentally global problem, how are you aiming to address this with, like working with your primary school here and sort of extrapolating this?
Yeah, well, actually, and another really key aspect of that, which is true locally as well as globally, is certainly we're thinking of things very much from a kind of two-way learning perspective, that we want to be incorporating learning as much from those communities that are, experiencing the issues or can identify themselves much more clearly what the potential solutions are. So it's very much about a two-way learning process, and how can you embed somehow into the educational system that two-way learning process. So I was describing to you a minute ago, and a few other people in the room, a project that we're doing locally here in Cambridge, in the Fenland. So there's a big, the region around Cambridge is very flat. It's a bit like in the Netherlands. It's all reclaimed land from the 17th century. At the moment, it's heavily farmed. It's a big agricultural region, but there's a real challenge from a climate perspective, because there's farming that land, it's peatland, and it can create large amounts of emissions of greenhouse gases. So there's a need to transition the land and the land use, but that's obviously a big challenge for the societies that live and work and been working the land for generations. So we're looking to work with the communities in the who live in that landscape to to have a dialogue about the different potential solutions, so that we're engaging them as part of the process, but really importantly, because they're the ones that have the knowledge. And so I think it's about not seeing education as being that one-way process of imparting knowledge, but it's also about how can we access the knowledge that exists in communities. And that's true on a local level, but it's also very true on a global level as well. How can we ensure that we're not in a kind of colonial way, just going and imparting one particular worldview on everyone, but how do we actually recognize that there's important information and knowledge to be incorporated as well?
That actually brings me to the next question, which comes from someone in the audience as well. And that's about the kind of potential blind spot between knowledge, research, science, and its application for this kind of new future of education. Avi, could you talk to this in terms of how you see that and what the role is of science, knowledge versus its application and influencing the future of education?
Well, I think it goes back maybe to the point you mentioned before about are we the right people to deal with those questions? And I think the answer for this question, and for both questions, is that we need those different angles together in the same room. Like we need the science, and we need the entrepreneurs, and we need the educators, and we need the students, which we usually don't hear. And it's very easy to say. I can say that this is extremely difficult to do. Like mindset model of operation is a lot about that. And there is a lot of research why it's so difficult to do. There is a very interesting research of Northwestern University about problem solving through diverse group, and diverse in two senses. One, the disciplines from different areas, and second, the culture and race, etc. And the effectiveness of a diverse group is extremely higher than the homogeneous one. But when you're interviewing the people in the groups, the homogeneous one will tell you it was an excellent experience. We did great together, although their outcomes were very, very poor. And the heterogenic one will say it was a terrible experience. We suffered from every minute, and the effects was extremely good. So it's not trivial to do those connections, but this is probably the key, because it's a complex problems world, and we need those different angles together. Otherwise, it would stay a business perspective that is not resonating to the users, or it will stay a research that is disconnected to the field problems, etc. So it's a
Another question, which seems to preoccupy quite a few people here, is about the kind of the edtech myth and how frustrating it can be. So Avi, I'm going to go back to you, but then also to Azaya and Emily, because obviously edtech is kind of a big word. It does frustrate a lot of people, and for potentially quite good reasons. So I'd quite like to have your perspective on this.
Well, one of my colleagues talks about edtech using the terms BC and AD, like before COVID and after disease. And in a way, I think edtech was reborn in the last 2 years because we moved from an ecosystem of early adopters, which probably are about 15% of the target audience, to an ecosystem of forced adopters that are the majority of the ecosystem. And this, I think, will enable edtech to be real in the sense that each one of us is using technology and living in a technology space as an individual, but until lately, because all the reasons that we know, like the economy was not there, the urge was not there for the user side, the habits that I mentioned beforehand, we didn't really experience technology as part of the world of education. And I think many of the solutions of edtech that we came to use and to learn to work with were amplifiers of the old system. And I believe that we'll see now a totally different kind of solution. We already see startups that hints that this is going to be the direction, but I'm not sure we're going to call them edtech anymore. I think it's like we are not doing edtech when we are using I don't know, Google Drive. We're just using and we don't do edtech when you're using social media. And in the same way, I think a lot of the things that we used to see as a very specific vertical of educational technology will be a general technology.
Yeah, so I don't think I have an awful lot more to say other than what you said. I think that the description that you gave of blind spots meets opportunity is precisely where edtech ought to be going. That, you know, the opportunity of technology is there, and what's necessary is to use that in creative ways, and that's about bringing together that you know, visionary thinking to understand where the blind spots are, and where therefore that you can create an opportunity for not amplifying the things of the past, but instead for creating the opportunities.
And I suppose I would just add that perhaps technology will be used to help kind of scale a lot of the practices that we engage with. So all of the tools that we may use on a day-to-day basis, like TikTok, for example, just launched a $50 million education fund to support creators who are specifically designing content for educational purposes. Similarly, Roblox, which is an online programming tool, aims to kind of reach 100 million users who will then use Roblox to pursue different educational needs. And so I think there's a really great and exciting opportunity where technology will be used, especially like Web 3.0, in the context of decentralized information, to ensure that a lot of the kind of issues we've spoken about today and topics can reach people from around the world. And similarly, where we, as I suppose in the UK, can have access to other forms of knowledge, indigenous knowledge. And so I reckon and I envision and hope that technology will be used to remove a lot of the kind of barriers that currently exist, barriers around what kinds of knowledge we value, what kinds of knowledge we think is useful and insightful. And I'm already kind of seeing glimmers of that at the moment. So I'm excited to see how technology will continue to challenge our assumptions and ensure that we have access to different kinds of knowledge and ontologies.
Another question, and it was bound to pop up actually in a few different shapes and forms, the role of the teacher and agency, because we talked a lot about agency in learners and for, but actually the role of agency in teachers, and is technology potentially also going to be a blind spot in that agency? So you're looking at unboxing school. Unboxing the school also involves the teacher. How do you see that happen, and how do you kind of see that for the future of education?
Well, it's first of all, we have some kind of activities now with schools that we are really testing those assumptions of unboxing school, and we do a process with them. We work with 7 schools like this. And the point that you raised is one of the most interesting and challenging one, because I think the first reactions of the teachers who are going through those kind of processes and putting much more room for self-learners, etc., is this questioning about their profession. And I think the more successful cases are the teachers that really try to move from a position in which they are inheriting knowledge to a position that they are supporting a learning process. And I can say that the most radical examples that we saw in this sense are teachers that are supporting learning in subject matters that they don't understand nothing about, but they do understand a lot about learning and about time management and they are adults, and I think kids needs adults' perspective when they're going through this kind of challenges. And when this happens, it's extremely impressive. Like, I think something really is happening there, and it's a great message for the kids that the teacher says, I don't understand nothing about physics. I'm an history teacher, but I can teach you something about how to try to face the challenges you're facing right now. So I think probably this is the direction. Is again very easy to say. It's a lot of struggle working with teachers around those lines, because as they are much more professionals, it's even more difficult for them to think about this way of teaching, because they were trained to be experts in their domain and not experts in supporting and mentoring, etc. It's a totally different skill set.
Emily, can I extrapolate on this? Because you mentioned moral purpose. You mentioned, sort of the word democracy, also in relation to agency and learners understanding what moral purpose and democracy means, and how they can then sort of apply that in what they do. How do you see the influence of geopolitics in the role of the teacher, but also in sort of achieving this vision of moral purpose, ethics, and a sense of democracy that may be interpreted very differently by different people?
Yeah, I think you've highlighted a really important aspect. I was actually just sitting here as we were just discussing this. My own personal research area currently is actually AI and how we can use AI in the context of climate science and environmental science more generally. And I was, one of the topics that comes up sometimes is, could teachers be replaced by some AI system? And of course, actually, in some aspects, possibly. But almost certainly not in those aspects that you've just highlighted. And so, in trying to envision a new educational paradigm, then perhaps we should be embracing technology, including AI, for some aspects of the educational process, and then redefining what the role of a teacher is and where a human teacher can really support some of those broader aspects of the way in which we're hoping to shape global citizens into the future.
Sorry, I think you as a, working with young people in a very new university setting, using very different teaching paradigms that actually don't seem to rely very much on technology at all. How do you kind of respond to what Emily's just said?
So I think we do rely on technology. I think hybrid has been a beautiful game changer in many ways because it has allowed people to engage in material, in conversation and discussions from their place of comfort, as opposed to being in a place that perhaps would impede or intimidate them from being able to share different perspectives. And so one of the things I've been thinking about quite a bit, and in preparation for the talk, I was thinking a lot about how perhaps in 100 years' time, it will be difficult to discern the lecturer from the student from the employer, similarly the home from the university to the workplace. And I think that's really exciting because it shows that we are continuously learning and unlearning. And so I think it's really interesting in my case because I'm simultaneously a student doing my PhD, but in the LIS context, I'm facilitating discussions, and I like to see myself more as a facilitator because I am open to learning as much from the students as hopefully they are to learning from me. And with term 3, my colleague and I have just assigned faculty to students for their projects, and you can imagine there are about 40 different projects that don't cover our areas of interest or expertise, but this is also an opportunity for us to learn and to invite the students to become experts who teach us. And so to your point, Abby and Emily, we'll be learning, we as faculty can help guide the students through how to research, how to kind of explore a topic, how to go broad and then figure out what it is you want to kind of hone in on with a given topic. And perhaps we can offer some guidance around what it means to define a problem and what it means to offer, or at least engage in robust research. But from a content perspective, we'll be learning as much as the students will be. And I think that's so invigorating to students as well. And it gives them a ton of agency to be able to teach us and to be comfortable knowing that they are teaching us content we are learning together. And so I think technology will just help all of us on this journey to learn and unlearn and to be comfortable with uncertainty.
Very interesting that you use the word unlearn, because that's becoming increasingly important in, how we function as societies and how we learn. And then you've got this horrible tension with this thing called curriculum, which of course in the Cambridge setting is a very, very important, aspect of what the university does and how it also exports curricula to international schools and, exams and all those kind of things that potentially quite a few of us may have a problem with. And also what we're discussing here is kind of taking us away from that sort of siloed curriculum and the way we understand curriculum at the moment, because there's something at odds with agency and curriculum, for instance. So how do you see that evolve, Abby, in terms of unboxing the school, and then both of you in terms of your own kind of view on education?
Well, I think maybe we should define between curriculum and expertise. Like we need experts in the end of the day, and there are domains that if we want to go deep, we need the mediation of the experts. But it shouldn't be like this is the only lead that happens during the learning process. And in the end of the day, we know that learning happens when we are taking agency and when we are active, when we are constructing the knowledge. So I think it should be sort of a combination between access to the experts, access to the state-of-the-art content. And of course, I think one of the challenges of our time is also defining between state-of-the-art content and problematic and content. And this, again, requires expertise, but a lot of agency on the student side. And I think one of the outcomes of this kind of approach can also make sure that we are keeping the content that we are observing as updated. And many of the new disciplines that we are facing right now are changing rapidly. Like one of our startups is dealing with cyber education. And he told me that every year, about 30% of the content is modified. So about, let's say, 3 years, we have a totally different kind of corpus of content. And I think in order really to keep those disciplines alive, we must have this equilibrium between the independent learner and the access to the experts whenever it's needed.
Yeah, well, in the climate area, the need to provide new or to support new skills to help support a net zero future or a climate resilient net zero future around the world is really pressing. So pretty much every country of the world, there is a huge opportunity for new green jobs, but there aren't currently the training to support those new green jobs. As I say, that's very much a global issue. And in fact, actually, although there's often much talk about flows of finance and indeed technology from the developed world to the developing and least developed countries of the world on the climate side, there's very much less talk about how education can be supported globally, and that skills training can be supported globally. So it is a very real issue, and I think, you know, in the context of the conversation that we've been having, for that to be successful, then it very much needs to be not just a one-way process of importing skills, but it needs to be developed in the context of how to identify not only locally relevant training, but training that actually encompasses the locally generated knowledge into the training process itself. So that's both a huge opportunity, but also a huge challenge as to how do we actually deliver and realize that. It's one thing to have the vision, but completely different thing to actually implement it. But it's a very real challenge on the climate side.
All right. Of course, we've just highlighted curriculum. With curriculum, the word assessment is never very far. We know how we assess now. What do you think assessment should look like going forward, and how do we go about it? Azad?
Sure. So what will assessments look like? Something we're thinking about quite deeply. In fact, later this afternoon, I'll have a conversation with a couple of colleagues to explore how we come up with marking criteria for term 3, because we're inviting students to carry out quant and core research, but then also design and make a product. And as I mentioned before, that can range from a series of TikTok videos all the way through to an op-ed piece, all the way through to an app or a website. And so how do we create a robust kind of curriculum marking criteria that assesses the students fairly? And I think it's inspired us to think about what is it that we want to see in these assessments, in these products. And that's kind of invited us to look at three key concepts: originality, integrity, and relevance. And so how have these students engaged with research? How have they carried out robust research into the area? And how has that research informed the expression and communication of the product? And so it's very much a work in progress. And what I love about the ways in which I suppose LIS allows us to think is that we get to iterate very quickly. And so we get feedback from students. For example, for this term, we invited students to make a 1-minute video as part of a qual assessment. And they also had to make a slide deck and respond to a journal article paper looking at the fair trade flower market in Kenya. And they had to kind of dissect it from a systems thinking and design thinking approach, write an 800-word report, and then also produce a slide deck. And so all of that to say, we're very open-minded with the ways in which we invite students to critically engage with the material. And I think what we're finding is offering students options in terms of how they relate to content is definitely the way forward. I suppose the challenge is just how do we create a fair and robust marking system so that we assess students on kind of a level playing field. And I think coming up with concepts around integrity, originality, and relevance is perhaps one step in that direction.
Avi, can I ask you a question around how you see assessment? You know, I'm thinking of your beautiful Samuel Beckett's quote, and failure. And by definition, assessment is something that you shouldn't really fail. So how does that kind of extrapolate going forward?
Assessment is one of the areas that one of the verticals that Mindset looking ahead wants to focus more deeply. Because I think the sentiment that it's not effective anymore and the damages about the regular kind of assessments methods I think it's very wide, and many people share this sentiment both in the professional world of assessment and evaluation, and the opportunities that technology brings to this world, beside of trying to change the habits that we have, I think are about two interesting areas. One is about reducing the amount of tests. Like, we are very used to this ceremony of being tested, and I think there's some value in those ceremonies because we are really preparing ourselves towards them, etc. But of course, the price is very high, and the weight that they are carrying is too big. And when we are working or living in a technological environment, we have so many data points potentially about the place of the learner. So we can evaluate and assess a lot of things without having this ceremony, and in a way that also, going back to the agency point, it's not just a dashboard that goes to the teachers, it's a dashboard that's shared with the student and the teacher and their parents in real time. So this is one direction. It's of course a lot of challenges. One of the surprising reactions for this trend that I received from students were that they don't want to know so much about their achievements. Like, this dashboard that you're showing to me has too much information for me. I don't want to know about it. So I think it's something that we should explore, but this is a very interesting direction. And the other one is being able to measure or assess the stuff that we could not really do in the old world. And this, going back to Isaiah's point about collaborative or creativity or other stuff. And one of the startups that we work with generated sort of a platform for a conversation, which looks more or less like the forums of the 90s, but it has AI behind it. And it can tell you before you're entering a room that the quality of the discussion in this room is excellent or pretty bad or mediocre. And he has a measurement for each speaker in the room about the way he communicates with the others. Like, he say, Carla, you are speaking only with 2 people in the group, not with the whole group. You are arguing a lot and rarely agrees. And you don't bring any evidence for the claims that you are claiming. And then, first of all, you have tools like this to assess things that we could not really assess beforehand, but we also, through the assessment, guide the student to hack the system and to speak in a way that, in the end of the day, reach the goals that it was entering in the first place. So I think those two kinds of directions are really opening new horizons for the world of assessment.
There we go. Yeah, let me just add a tiny little bit onto it, which is, so, I mean, I'm a mathematician. I studied mathematics originally, so I'm a mathematician by background, and I am absolutely disastrous at my times table. Most of my children will tell you, I can't even, I struggle with what 8 times 9. And yet, in a simplistic sense, people think that that's what mathematics is about. And actually, as a research mathematician, you would say the more fundamental thing about mathematics is actually about identifying patterns, for example, which is not something that's formally ever assessed. So I always smile at the formal assessments. But I think the challenge going forwards is, how do you create a framework for assessment that isn't inherently tied to any particular worldview or value set? So how do we one of the topics that we've been somewhat interspersed throughout our conversation today is the importance of integrating diversity into education. So how do we embed, in a really fundamental way, diversity into the assessment process as well? Because that, again, that's going to be another real challenge in order to achieve, because you do want to have some framework, but whatever framework you put in place is almost inevitably going to be put in place by someone with a particular worldview. So I don't have an answer, but I see it as a challenge.
Obviously, from assessment and learning and school and university or any form of education and learning, the world of work. And obviously that's in a complete flux, very fast flux, continuous flux. Education is in flux, but it ain't changing very much. And I mean, we're looking at it 100 years ahead. So the boundaries between learning and education are continuously blurring more and more. So how do you see that sort of evolve? You work with a lot of young people who are on the brink of, moving from education to work, and probably some of them are working already. I would imagine quite a few of them. But so how do you see that, and how do you see that sort of reflected in your students as well?
So I think in my case, I worked in different industries throughout my undergrad. So I tried corporate law, criminal law, product design at Airbnb in San Francisco, and investment banking. And so having all of those experiences throughout my degree while I was learning anthropology, psychology, computer science, engineering science, really helped me think through, how do I communicate what I'm learning in the classroom to the real world? And it also forced me to translate projects and essays that I had done at university into things that could form part of my application process to some of these companies. And so in my coaching sessions with students, I often encourage them and invite them to think through how they could translate what they're learning in their classes to, say, an internship that they want to do. How can they think through, how can that be kind of a framework through which they think about their courses? Because, as you alluded to, there's so much opportunity to bridge the gap between work and university. And I think typically, like, a lot of my friends, when they were going through university, would have studied economics if they wanted to work in an investment bank, would have studied law if they wanted to work at a law firm, studied medicine if they wanted to be a doctor. But we're seeing many shifts and changes in that. A lot of my friends who studied medicine are now exploring private equity or management consulting, or have founded their own companies. Friends who studied law are now working in edtech, for example. And I think being able to comfortably engage with that reality and invite our students to see that, actually, I don't have to study a specific degree in order to pursue a specific career, has been really reassuring for them. And I think it's just broadened their horizons and made them realize that the world really is their oyster. And I think, in a conversation I had just in the break, there was a question around what will our students go on to do. I think we shouldn't set limits around what they were going to do, because to prescribe what they were going to do would be to almost invalidate the point of LIS. Like, the whole reason we exist is to challenge current ideas and notions around what it means to learn and what it means to study, what it means to study in silos, and then to explore how your learning process can almost allow you to create your own job. And so I'm excited to see what jobs our students create for themselves moving forward.
Yeah, so it's often said that the students, undergraduate students of today have much less rigid view of what their future careers might be than perhaps my generation or older generations had. And I think that's true. But at the same time, if I think, I mentioned a minute ago, my children, I've got two daughters who are 6 and 8. If you ask the 8-year-old what she wants to be when she grows up, she says she either wants to be a hairdresser or prime minister. She's not sure which, she's erring towards prime minister, but and if you ask the 6-year-old, she says that, well, she did say she wanted to be an astronaut, but then she heard that it was really expensive to go into space. I think she's been hearing about some of Elon Musk's activities, so she's not sure any longer. But you know, what I find interesting about that is that even at 6 and 8, the education that they've been exposed to actually isn't about a continuously evolving career path over their lifetime. It's very specific. You know, you're a nurse or a doctor, and so even from a very young age, that's not been how they've been educated and what they've been exposed to. So perhaps, you know, there's an opportunity there for, if we are thinking that actually future careers need to be much more malleable and a much greater opportunities for a less rigid structure, then intervention and thinking about how that's represented at a very early age is very important.
Well, I think going back to the last 2 years, I think one of the most relevant phenomena for this question is the big resignation or the great quit that we see globally. I think in the US, we see it in China, and I think this movement of young people or less young people that are deciding to leave their jobs and to rethink about their path is not anecdotal anymore. It's something which deep, and I believe that can reflect afterwards on the next wave of new workers, because going back again to this notion of habits, we broke some of the habits of working, and we have this opportunity to relook about our lives and the work we're doing, and this requires us to have the skills to move to another place, and this is I think this generates another window, not just from the demand side, but also from the new type of labor people that are choosing what they do, so they have sort of agency again, but from this perspective.
Okay, I'm afraid time is up, but I'd like to thank you for this engaging conversation. I've certainly enjoyed it. I know you've all enjoyed it, and thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you.